Ask most people what they know about Cameroon, and the best informed may mention the national soccer team, the Indomitable Lions. Otherwise, the Central African country of about 24 million people rarely makes the headlines. Yet it deserves the international community's attention right now. If for nothing else, at least for the fact that thousands of English-speaking Cameroonians have now become refugees in Nigeria within the space of 2 years, while others have lost their lives. Worse still, towns and villages have been burnt down by unknown forces. But again, think about kids who once had parents and lived well and have now become orphans. These and more constitute a crisis that has crippled two viable regions. That is the Northwest and Southwest region in Cameroon. The difficult question is, how is the other part of the country doing amidst this crisis? Some say the answer is simple, referencing the October 7th presidential elections that was conducted under this tense climate without any of the candidates actually stepping foot to campaign in the Northwest and Southwest regions without armored vehicles, if at all they did. Joining me to talk about Cameroon's Anglophone crisis today is Mark Njo, a Nova Scotia lawyer who hails from Cameroon. Thanks for joining me, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
One would say what began as a peaceful protest of lawyers and teachers turned out to be a bloody and messy crisis. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the Anglophone crisis, as most people would call it, it's a long-standing crisis in Cameroon. It's a political crisis because the English-speaking peoples of Cameroon have often clamored for more rights, more autonomy, more linguistic rights, more development in their regions, and they felt that they've been marginalized within the Cameroonian polity. And so this problem has always been there, and it is just in need of good governance to actually address the problem.
What do you make of the fact that there's always been an Anglophone prime minister? There's always been Anglophones in many places in top government offices. And more still, when this whole thing started, the lawyers and teachers asked for changes which were more or less regarding the Anglophone or the English subsystem of education, as well as the common law. And I think the OHADA law, the OHADA charter was translated, and there are many things that were taken into account in order to kind of curb marginalization or the outcry. But how did the crisis transform from a teacher and lawyer issue to the point of people calling and asking for a change in the form of government, federation, secession, and the rest?
Well, I'm glad that you asked this question. Cameroon Constitution is a very robust constitution. One of the things that is mentioned in the constitution is that everybody is entitled to be treated equally, have equal rights, have equal access to the resources of the country, and is entitled to be equally expressive of their culture, their traditions, their language, recognizing that we have multiple languages in Cameroon, but English and French.
Are you talking about dialects?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have multiple dialects, let me put it that way, but English and French are the two main languages. They're the primary languages, right? Yeah. And so while the Constitution spells these things out, in reality, that is not the case. You know, the English-speaking peoples have been marginalized in so many different ways. You've listed some. I'm not going to go down the list. But one of the things that is very interesting and that I should point out to demonstrate that is that the reason the lawyers took to the streets was because they were demanding to have an English bar, to have a common law bar. Now, anybody would think that in a country that says they are bilingual, right? You have a French system, you have an English system, it would be natural that there would be, a common law bar, right? Because we have English laws, we have French laws, we have French civil law, we have English common laws. But because of that singular demand, they were treated the way they were treated. So that tells you about the extent of the marginalization. I need not say more.
Well, when you look at the fact that the country has gone from a federation to a united republic and now the republic, it's almost like a unification process is taking place.
Right.
So because Cameroon used to be a German colony, after that became a British and French trust territory, and later on, after independence and so on, became independent.
Right.
But you would think that that is part of the unification of the country. Why does that pose a problem if even the education system or the judicial system is kind of put together rather than being separated?
Well, that's why I premised my earlier comments by saying that bad governance has sort of exacerbated what would be called Anglophone crisis. Well, seriously, this began with just the marginalization of the English peoples. Now, but if there was good governance in Cameroon, I think you could address this problem, because like you have rightly said, there is a process of reunification that's ongoing. But because of bad governance, this reunification process hasn't been perfected or completed as it was supposed to be. And because of that incompletion, it has created a situation where the English-speaking Cameroonians feel marginalized, and in fact, they are marginalized. And so they have often found ways to express their concerns, and unless they express their concerns, nothing has ever been done. And the way they have always managed to get anything done for them is by taking to the streets. Cameroonian history is littered with that. For multi-party politics to have come into Cameroon, the English regions had to rise up. For an education board for the general certificate education, the GCE, to be installed to take care of the English subsystem of education, they had to take to the streets. For the Anglophones to get a university,
University of
Boya, they had to. So if you look at the history of Cameroon, this has always been the case. But if the reunification process was being completed in a way that was satisfactory to the English-speaking people, there would be no need for this.
Well, you would think that there's never been any country where a fraction is dissatisfied with the way the country is run. You can quote Spain, the Catalans. You can go even right into France.
Even Canada.
Right. But what I'm trying to understand with the case of the Anglophones in Cameroon, many have referred to it as a language issue.
No, I would say it's not a language issue. You rightly premised it by giving a little bit of the history of how this came to be. Now, reunification happened because people wanted to get together. Now, there was a small minority that was opposed to the two Cameroons coming together as one under a federation. Now, that minority has always existed, and they will always exist, right? So Cameroon has to come to terms with the fact that nationalistic tendencies are always going to exist within a fragment of the population. Now, the issue is, if the Cameroonian government were serious, it would be perfecting the reunification process by putting in place all the institutions that are needed to manage a process whereby two separate states are coming together to reunify to become one country, right? That doesn't just happen overnight. But systemically, the government has failed to do this. And you mentioned earlier that why has this turned messy? Now, when you fail because of bad governance to manage issues like this, they grow. And what has happened is the Anglophone problem has grown into now a constitutional problem, where that small minority that I was talking to you about has systemically grown and made gains, and now they have become a large group of people who are now demanding to revert back to the olden days where there were two separate states. And that is the crisis, so it's political, but it's also constitutional.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we will just try to go deep into how the crisis is manifesting. because we hear about ghost towns, we hear about people not going, kids not going to school, and this has been going on for far too long, and the repercussions, I think, many Cameroonians will suffer the consequences in years to come. When we come back, we'll try to talk about those other issues. You're still watching Worldview, a thought-provoking talk show where we handle issues of a variety of topics. And today we're talking about the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. And if you're following the news, you probably know all about it. But we're just trying to set a little bit of context with the current situation in the country and looking for solutions for the way forward. Don't go nowhere. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
They are being slaughtered like animals. Some of them are displaced. Some of them now are living in the bushes. All our houses are being burned down, especially in our Abu village. Our houses are all burned. People are displaced. People are living in bushes. Their maize, their food has been burned. Their material, their property has been burned. That is what has prompted women to come here today, because it is beyond them. It is beyond them, and we know that nobody is hearing us except our Almighty God. That's why we are here, and we believe that through our prayer today, our children will go back to school.
Welcome back. If you're just tuning in, you're watching Worldview, a thought-provoking talk show where we handle a variety of issues. And today we are handling the case in Cameroon, the Anglophone crisis. And my guest is Mark Njo, a Nova Scotia lawyer who hails from Cameroon and actually has a lot to share on the issues going on in the Central African country that was once known as the peaceful Cameroon, Africa in miniature. And looking at the Anglophone crisis, I just want to come back to where we left off.
Right.
And my point is, at this time, let's talk about how the crisis is manifesting itself with regards to what the government has actually done to kind of subdue the grievances and to look into the solutions, because a commission on bilingualism was created.
That's right.
And manned by a former Prime Minister,
Yeah.
Peter Mafani Musonge,
Yeah.
and did a tour across the country and crisscross those two regions in particular, and to add it with some of the changes that were done and the recruitment processes for Anglophones. So for Anglophones to have a Prime Minister, Anglophones to have ministers who are in government, at this point with the crisis on ground, what are the dynamics? What is holding many people from accepting these changes that the government has made?
It's because the changes are not trickling down to the people at the bottom. The changes are staying at the top. You know, to have an Anglophone Prime Minister is a politician. You know, yeah, these guys are competent. These guys are, you know, good guys. But, you know, the ordinary man doesn't see how it benefits him that there's an Anglophone Prime Minister. You know, his pocket doesn't tell him that. When his children go to school and they're being taught in a language that they don't want to learn in, it doesn't benefit him that. So those are the practical realities, right? Like, for example, I was talking about the common law bar. To have a common law bar, it just makes sense, because you have all these lawyers who go to school studying the common law, graduate out of the common law, and yet there's no common law bar. So those are the kind of things that people want to see, not you appointing an Anglophone to be a prime minister. By the way, the constitution, the prime minister doesn't have that much powers. You know, Cameroon's democracy is a presidential style democracy. The constitution embeds a lot of powers in the hands of the president. The prime minister is even the fourth person in terms of accession to power if anything were to happen. So, that mere appointment of people to positions doesn't cut it. And the reason it doesn't really cut it is because the institutions themselves are deficient. If the institutions of governance were working so that the people felt that their concerns that are personal to them were being addressed, then, all of these other cosmetic things would maybe be the icing on the cake. But you can't do the cosmetics when on the ground the substantive is not there. Now, you talked about the Commission on Bilingualism. What has the Commission on Bilingualism done? I mean, they made a tour and went around the country and said, look, we're going to, bring change. We're going to try to make things better. But, it's been one cosmetic effort after another. And I don't want to be overly critical of the government because, in fact, the government is, they're doing some things, right? They're doing some things to try to alleviate the issue. But the thing is, it's not good enough because the institutions that are supposed to back these things up and enforce these things and make it more substantive are lacking. And so the people don't feel it. They have no trust in the institutions of government. And therefore, the problems have not been addressed. And by the way, I would also mention that there's a lot of people that when the crisis started, they were rounded up and thrown in jail. So you can't be saying that you are addressing the problem while some of the people who were the ones who raised these issues that are now apparently being addressed are still sitting behind bars. Doesn't make sense for a lot of people, right? So those are the realities that don't rhyme. And that's why people, despite the best efforts, I may call it, of the regime, people still feel as if nothing is being done to alleviate their problems.
So what do you make of the other part of the country also has issues? If you go to the east region, you go to the north, far north, you can see areas where the same problems that the English-speaking regions are raising, these areas are facing. It's a problem because it's not for nothing that most African countries, I mean almost all, are considered third world countries. A lot of debt, a low employment, and so many other things, which makes it impossible for any government to be able to provide right to the nitty-gritties for its citizens. But I wouldn't say that that's an excuse. Looking at the other side of the story, right, where you have francophones, because it's Anglophone, Francophone as a terminology is being used,
right,
say, well, we all are suffering. We understand that the Anglophones may think that they have a bigger right to the national cake, in quotes. So the question is, if the people fight as the Anglophones are fighting for all the reasons you've mentioned and more, how does that solve the problem if we are going to the third year and Anglophones, part of some of them have been termed secessionists, terrorists, and these things don't speak well because they end up creating a very hostile environment. In that regard, what are the Anglophone elite doing? Some of them are in government and in top places. What are they doing? What is your sense of their help? Yes, the government has not done much. What about the elite?
Well, your question is very loaded. So let me break it down. So I'll start by talking about the other regions of Cameroon. Now, when we talk about bad governance doesn't just target certain people. Bad governance affects everybody. So every Cameroonian is affected by the bad governance, the failure of institutions, the lack of trust. That affects everybody. So those regions are affected. The Anglophone people don't deny that. But the Anglophone people say where there is bad governance that breeds that kind of hostile environment where people are struggling to survive, the people who form the minority, the people who are already being marginalized because they are a minority, suffer a lot more. And that's the simple argument. Nobody is denying that other people in other parts of the country are suffering. And that is why, in fact, the Anglophones have said that all the other people should rally up together with them so that they can oust the government, so that they can...
Well, they had the opportunity to do it. Elections just took place. So what happened?
Well, that's the question. You know, that's a question for another day. What happened there, right? And that's why when I talk about people mobilizing, like real mobilization, not just talking, like mobilization. You saw what happened in the United States. People who were outraged about the governance of President Trump rallied and knocked doors, did, you know, some hard campaigning to elect people to the House. So that's the kind of initiatives that we need to see. You know, we need to stop the fighting. Fighting is not going to do anything. Fighting is only going to worsen the problem. If we really want to solve this problem, then we need to prove to whoever is in power that we can mobilize and we can hold them accountable. There's nothing like people power, and that's what's needed.
Just hold that thought right there. We would segue into the part where we talked about the help international community, which has somewhat been very silent, and international media and all that. We just take a quick break. When we come back, we'll try to handle those. And thank you. Don't go nowhere. Just stay tuned. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're watching Worldview, and you've heard it before, a thought-provoking talk show where we handle a variety of issues that really get you thinking, and you really zoom in on some areas of life and the world, and you learn something, and you also go and do some research for better understanding. And today I'm joined by Mark Njo. We're just wrapping up. We're the third part of the show, and we're just trying to talk about the Anglophone crisis, and we're digging deep into some of the steps that the government has taken to solve the crisis, and we're also looking at the way the crisis is playing out on the two Anglophone regions, the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon, and how this has actually disrupted the normal day-to-day life of the ordinary man on the street in Cameroon. And to go into the last phase of what we were talking about, I want us to focus on the way Anglophones, the people who are actually clamoring for change in their regions, the way they have been conducting themselves in the guise, because at this point where youths have taken arms, at this point where there is a term for those who don't want to be part of the United Republic of Cameroon, to be part of the Republic of Cameroon, they are being termed secessionists, they are being termed separatists, they are being termed everything. And at the same time, within the regions, there are people who have been maimed for going to the bushes, for going to the farms, I would say, to go for work, for everything, who are not respecting ghost towns. They are being considered traitors. At the same time, you have on the other side youths who have taken the bushes and say they are the lords who have to dictate how people will live their lives in the towns and villages, and making life really difficult. If the Anglophones are calling on the international community to be of help, to support, to mediate, to bring pressure to bear on the government for changes to come, how are they themselves, how are the Anglophones helping their cause?
Well, I am one that supports non-violent, peaceful protest. I am not one that supports violence, but in this case, I would say that what has happened is that an absence or a lack of leadership on this issue from when it started, right, led to where we are. Now, I'm not saying that everybody on one side or the other side don't have blame, but what I'm saying is that when we look at these issues are nuanced, right, we should look at it from the perspective of leadership. You know, the absence of leadership, the president of the country never even addressed the concerns of these people for almost more than a year. He never said anything about the concerns that were raised. So what else were the people supposed to do? Now, all of the non-violent protest that happened was quashed down. So what were the people supposed to do? Now, I believe that we, the people, the Anglophones, the English-speaking peoples, made a point with the ghost towns. They made a point with the non-violent street protest. They made a point with the lawyers walking off the jobs. They made a point with the teachers taking to the street. They made a point with all of the non-violent aspects. But I think the government got the message, but I think the government mishandled its response by clamping down and trying to coerce people to some kind of agreement or subjugation. I think that the peoples haven't done themselves any favors too, because picking up arms, look,
where do they even get these arms?
Well, a lot of people started out with den guns. You know, me and you know from growing up back home that, you know, there's a lot of people that would argue that by deploying the military to sort of to sort of quell down, you know, the protest, the non-violent protest, that was sort of an attack. And that's what...
Well, we see water cannons everywhere. We see tear gas even in Western democracies where people take to the streets. As long as, if you really disturb public order, there is a big chance, there's a greater chance that the police will be out there to bring order.
And that is why, one of the reasons why we are engaged in this conversation is for educative purposes. You know, it's to also educate our people that, yes, non-violent, peaceful protest, I think, but you also have to understand the context in which you operate. You know, you are a citizen in a state. A state is always going to try to maintain law and order in some way, because that is the prerogative of the state, to maintain security for all its citizens as enshrined in their constitutions. And so where these things happen, people always expect that, you know, somehow, you know, the governments are just going to roll over. No, they are not. The governments are always going to send out, you know, security forces in the name of security, and there's going to be excesses. So it's exactly what happened in this case. Back to the issue of guns. These guys took up, you know, den guns, and, you know, in a way, this was a last desperate measure to try to get some real, meaningful, substantial attention. I do not support that. I've never supported any form of violence, but I have said that I recognize that people do have the right to defend themselves, right? It's a universal right of self-defense, you know, given to everybody. Right?
But Cameroon is not a country where we have open carry, or people are allowed to own guns and do what they will with it.
That's right. And I wasn't saying that in the sense that, you know, that's what I was just referring to, the general universal right that people have to be able to defend themselves. Now, do I support, you know, people taking up arms against the government? No, I don't support that.
And killing military officials, for that matter, which again, many would argue that the reason why the international community hasn't criticized President Paul Biya is because, first of all, there's Boko Haram in the north, and there are many foreign troops who are using Cameroon as a hub to be able to fight this declared terrorist group. And at the same time, Cameroon is trying to build bilateral relationships with other countries in the sub-region, because Cameroon is almost like a big center when it has to do with the CEMAC region.
Cameroon is a very key partner and a very key strategic, geostrategic partner for security in that region. The region is very volatile. You have the Central African Republic that was going through upheavals. You have the Congo down, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo, that has been in conflict. You have, you know, Mali that is up there, that has been having some problems with Islamists. So you have the French in Chad and in Cameroon exploiting oil. You have the Americans in Equatorial Guinea. You have the Brits in the Niger Delta. And so all of these countries and just the other day, Russia was in the Central African Republic. So all of these countries have an interest in that region. And so it's equally in their best interest to ensure that Cameroon remains peaceful, democratic, and that all the citizens want to be there and live in peace. Because if there is a conflict in Cameroon that spills out into the other regions, then it's going to create a security in the Gulf of Guinea that is not good for the businesses or for the economic interest of all these countries in the region. So that is why I'm saying it's twofold. These countries need to pay more attention and try to help push for a meaningful dialogue in Cameroon. On the same front, the people within Cameroon themselves need to realize that nobody, and I know that I've just said something contrary, but nobody is coming to be the savior to stop this. Cameroonians are going to have to dialogue among themselves. Cameroonians are going to have to figure this out among themselves.
So you're just taking us into the solutions part, which should actually be the last phase of this conversation. And in that part, we've not mentioned the name Ambazonia.
Yeah.
In the entirety of this episode, and it's for a purpose, because that is a topic on its own,
right,
and should be dealt with appropriately in looking at all the aspects that constitute that word and the name and whatever it represents.
I'm looking forward to that.
To the English-speaking people of Cameroon. So we'll just take a quick break, and when we come back, we will try to just point out almost like a summary and look at the solutions, if there are any, as to how the Anglophone crisis could be resolved, which many look forward to, and so kids can go back to school and life can return back to normal. Don't go nowhere, stay tuned. We're right back on WORLDVIEW.
My lords, the Cameroon is in the grip of a humanitarian disaster that threatens to affect it and indeed the whole region. The Anglophone communities in that country see their rights, see their expectations of a prosperous and safe life trampled underfoot. My lords, this crisis has its origins in a plebiscite of 1961, which I, in my own childhood, in the region at the time, recall as being of concern then, certainly to the region, to my father, who was a cabinet minister in a neighboring country, but also and significantly to members of this House and the other place, who saw in a flawed plebiscite that posed simply a binary question to the English-speaking regions of the Cameroon: join Nigeria or join Francophone Cameroon. That was the choice that was given them. They were not given the choice to form their own independent state. My lords, we live with the legacy of that plebiscite in the plight of the peoples of the Cameroon, and the English-speaking peoples of the Cameroon in particular, to this day.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're watching WORLDVIEW, and my guest is Mark Njo, a Nova Scotia lawyer who hails from Cameroon, and we're talking about the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon that is pitting the English-speaking regions of the country against the entire part of the country, the rest, I would say. And we were talking about the solutions and trying to look at what role can the international community play. And I want to ask a series of questions which I think many have been wondering. And the question is simple. Britain had been the colonial master of this Anglophone region. What has Britain done ever since the crisis began?
Well, several things have been done. The British Parliament organized a hearing on the issue, Several members of parliament have written letters, asking that the British government look into it and encourage dialogue. At the level of the Commonwealth, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth actually visited Cameroon to try to, and visited, I think, one or two of the regions that were experiencing this crisis. There's been a lot of push, right, within Britain, but they haven't done enough yet.
Now let's turn over to France. France and Britain had to split Cameroon when they defeated Germany after the First World War, and that's what created the small two provinces that we have now. Because I think, not that I think, but that was a fact. The northern part of the English-speaking part of Cameroon at the time under the British rule decided to join Nigeria, and so the map of Cameroon has a slim top because of that reality. And so the bottom part, which again was never big, accepted to reunite with the Francophones and stay with the Republique du Cameroon at the time, which had its independence in 1960. So the question is France not doing something on its own to try to bring peace and see that the country stays unified?
Well, the French are interesting. France has a lot of economic interest in Africa in general. You know about the France-Afrique. You've heard about the Francophonie. So France is heavily invested in Cameroon. So they do have a huge interest in ensuring that things go smoothly and there is peace. But the question is France willing to do more than just talk? Because the French have spoken, they've talked about peace, they've talked about dialogue, but we also know that the regime in Cameroon is very close to the French, right? The French government has a lot of influence on the regime. And so the question is, how far is France willing to push the regime to do something meaningful? And that's what's been lingering. But
I know it's kind of confusing when states say they declare state sovereignty, and they say they don't want interference from foreign nations, and they say we're no longer talking about colonization, countries are independent. But isn't it a funny thing that whenever these countries are in a crisis, they run back to the colonial masters?
Because, independence was some sort of it was real, but it was also very symbolic. There is what we call neo-colonization. So a lot of the colonial masters, although they handed over and said, yeah, here's your independence, take it, they still had a lot of economic interests that were tied in these countries. They had a lot of control over the finance, the governance structures of these countries. And so that transition has taken maybe a lot longer than it would normally take. And so a lot of these ties have remained, right? And that's why, for a long time in Cameroon, you would know this, franc CFA, and for most of Central West Africa, that used the franc CFA, that currency was tied to the French franc, right? For the longest time, even when France joined the euro, the currency was still tied to the French franc.
It's still tied to the date.
It's still tied to date. Okay, so those things, I was talking about earlier, the British are, exploiting oil in the Niger Delta region. It's no coincidence that they happen to be the colonial masters of Nigeria, and so these ties are never going to be severed. These ties are always going to exist. The question is, how can we use these ties to make better the lives of people in both countries, be it the colonial masters or be it in the new nation?
The question too on that note is this: you have Africans ruling Africa, and yet they are not doing what they are supposed to do. So which one was better? The colonial master or the Africa with Africans in charge?
You want me to answer that question?
It's a question. It's a question.
I would say it's always better when you're independent and you're in charge of your own destiny. But again, as we would say, part of it is just the colonial mentality hasn't left some of the people who are current leaders. They, for some reason, they still don't take ownership of the fact that now you're in charge. You are supposed to be working hard to make the country better, to make the lives of the citizens better, and to put your country out there to compete, because we live in a competitive world. You might have friends, you might have foes, but in the international community, there's a lot of competition among states. And that's how, states work, they collaborate, sometimes in these competitions, sometimes they compete against each other. And so I haven't understood why a lot of the leaders still haven't taken it in pride to want to represent their countries and make it the best that they can, and also be competitive with all these countries. I mean, a lot of people admire, Western democracies. They look up to it. They go out there. They come out, send their children to come and study out here. But you keep asking the questions. Why can't we do that to the homeland? Why can't we make life better for everybody in the homeland? And we have the ability. That's exactly what the Anglophones are asking for. They are saying for 57 years, we have been trying to perfect this union, and we have gotten the short end of the stick. And they want things to be better. Not all the Anglophones want to break away and separate from Cameroon. No. A lot of them want to stay. A lot of them want to be together. But they are simply saying, by our very nature as English-speaking Cameroonians, being also a minority within this union, we should be alleviated of the concerns that we have raised. Our concerns should be paid attention to. People should hear our voices. Even if they don't do anything to solve the problems, at least create the atmosphere where people can express dissent, where people can express their problems freely. It was funny that the lawyers were in the Constitutional Council talking about federation, talking about separation, talking about, all sorts of things. I never seen any police officer go there and grab one of them and drag them out as they were doing to the guys who took to the street. Traders, teachers, farmers, school children were marching on the streets, and we've all seen the videos of how the security forces were rough handling these people.
When you look at the law is clear in Cameroon. If you have to hold any public meeting, you have to obtain authorization from either the divisional officer.
But the Constitution says that there's freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And yes, that's right.
That's why you need to get that authorization. You need to notify the authorities that you're going to have this rally, that you're going to have this protest, that you're going to have this.
But who appoints the divisional officers?
Well, it is, again, that's what I say. Well, from what it looks like, it's that you can criticize the law, but the law is the law. So how do you live within that context?
That is where the law has to afford people the real opportunities to do the things that the law contemplates. So when the Constitution says freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, yes, we understand that there's going to be checks and balances so that this freedom of expression doesn't become injurious to other citizens. But tell me that anybody can go up to the divisional officer or to the governor and say, we're going to organize a protest to ask the government to attend to our needs, or we're going to go and organize a protest to talk about our unique identity as Anglophones, as some may say it, or Ambazonians, as some may want to call it. Do you really think that that governor is going to issue that permit?
Well, if they have done it and they've been refused or turned down, then what about the other protests or the other rallies that have taken place without people being arrested?
Well, you know, that's a legitimate, that's a good point. I mean, you know, that's why I say these issues are very nuanced. You can't look at it from one lens. Of course, people can congregate in Cameroon and have an assembly and talk about whatever, and they're gonna go scot-free. Of course, there's been protests in Cameroon that has been well organized, and you know, the security forces haven't been pulling people over. But the reality is that every time the English-speaking minorities have taken up to the streets, it is because of something serious. And every time they have done that, they have been met with the most brutish of force. This is, I'm not making this up. This is fact. It's factual. You can look this and research this in Cameroon history. It's very true. And so when that happens over time, that impresses it on the people that there must be something wrong with them and airing their voices or raising their concerns. And that's the issue. It's not about, you know, what the law affords or that people can't take the law. I mean, when the lawyers went to the street, you know, I'm not going to sit here and second guess. I bet you they went and got permits. They got permits to organize the rallies. But were they not still beaten? Were their wigs not still taken away from them by security forces? They were.
Do you know if officers were punished for doing that?
I don't think any officers were punished for doing that. I mean, if officers were punished for doing that, at least the president of the republic could have come out and addressed the people and their concerns.
But we don't know the president of the Republic of Cameroon to be the type who is on the media or always in public spaces talking about.
Well, you're the president. The Constitution says the president is responsible for national unity. It says it right there in the Constitution.
Okay.
So, yes, we understand that his personality type, maybe, and we know this, he's not the one that comes out and speaks too much. But when there's that much upheaval in the country, that could, mind you, this president has been there since the beginning of the full formal government in these Cameroons. You know, he's been there since the 1960s. He's one of the architects of this constitution that is creating this constitutional crisis. So he knows, he's a smart guy. He went to law school. He's very smart. He knows that this crisis could have easily spilled into what it is today. So given that knowledge, don't you think that it was worthwhile even coming out of your comfort zone to say, hey, let me address you about your concerns?
He's made his speeches, and in those speeches, he has constantly said he is going to solve the Anglophone problem. He has heard the cries of the people. He's observing. He's commissioned the youth to do this, to do that, and he's been having his ministers taking the time to talk about all these issues on various platforms. Now, I do understand where you're going when you reference all of this. Where people really need more information and clarity is with regards to the fact that if none of this is happening and yet people are happy, some people are happy, 71% of the voting age or the electorate in Cameroon is happy.
Not 71, because mind you, again, it was only 3 million people who voted. Cameroon has a population of 24 plus million people with 12 million eligible people who are of eligible voting age.
But if 12 million people are eligible to vote, they have an opportunity to change the status quo. They don't go to register. Only 6.5 million end up registering. And then even of the 6.5 million, they don't want to go to vote. Only 3.5 million votes. It's democracy.
It's the lack of trust in the institutions.
But how do you change the trust if you don't participate in the democratic process?
Well, for the last 30 years, they have participated and the outcome has never been different.
Well, voters' turnout has always been low.
Well, voter turnout has declined because of the bad governance.
Well, I think bad governance, everywhere we hear government is the people. I mean, government is you and I. Government
Right.
is everybody. Because I don't think the president of the republic is an employee of Elecam. I don't think the president of the republic works in the offices where the people, the Anglophones say they are being marginalized, where they go and somebody is speaking French to them, they need someone to speak English. I don't think the president of the republic is out there on social media and everywhere else defending his mandate the way other people are defending it and in the way it's being played out. So somehow Cameroonians
He's the leader.
are involved in a part of the process.
Right.
So how do you explain that this situation is going on and on? Because we want to touch on the diaspora.
Right.
I'll just leave you to give a brief on what you think are the responsibilities right now as it stands of all the parties involved before we talk on the diaspora. What do you think is the responsibility of all the parties involved?
Okay. I think the president of the republic ought to call for an open dialogue. Actually, we should toss out the term dialogue, a truth and reconciliation. That's what's needed. I would even go further and premise it and say the 3 R's. Reconciliation, reconstruction, restoration. We need to restore Cameroon to its glory days. It's called the land of glory, land of promise, the miniature of Africa. We need to restore that. And for us to restore that, we need leadership. Leadership from the president. The president cannot say that I'm not everywhere, so therefore I can't be blamed. You know, the buck stops with him. People take their cues from him. All the bureaucrats that run the institutions that I have complained are not performing at their best, they take cues from him. So that's where we need to start. He needs to call for an open truth and reconciliation. Let us all discuss openly, without fear of persecution, without fear of reprimand, the truth about our history. And then let us all work towards reconciliation. It should be a collective process. You know, Cameroonians love that country. Cameroonians really love each other, like they do. You know, so there is no sense in continuing this fight and divide and rule tactics. You know, we should create a forum where Cameroonians can come and reconcile and then reconstruct. People need jobs, people need work, people need employment, people need money, kids need to go back to school. You know, there's so much that Cameroon has a very industrious young population. So we need to reconstruct. And so those are the things that I think the president of the republic can go out there, now that he just won his re-election, as you may say, he should travel across the country and say this to people. Get together, let's talk about the truth about our history, and let's work through these problems. The people on the other side, that's whether it's the separatists, secessionists, Anglophones, English-speaking, however you want to term them, they also need to do something proactive. And that is, we need to put down the weapons. The people who are in the forest, we need to come back out, and we need to say we are ready to work through this peacefully as brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and citizens, and we're ready to commit ourselves to the work to find a solution to it. We can't just sit on social media and talk and think that it's going to change things. Like I said, we have to mobilize. If it requires changing the vote at the ballot, we need to mobilize, go door to door and say, this is why you shouldn't vote for this president. This is why you should vote for this party. That's what needs to be done by Cameroonians, mobilizing people to the vote. We only had 6 million people registered to vote. We need to get all the 12 million eligible Cameroonians registered. That's not going to be done by social media. That's going to be done by volunteers going door to door and telling people, you need to go register. I'll take you to go register. I'll drive you to the pool. That's the kind of mobilization that you need. And on the day of the ballot, you need people, citizen observers. Our electoral code makes provision for that. It allows for citizen observers.
But candidates like Cabral Libi, he was third in the elections of October 7th. He came up with 11 millions d'inscrits. I would say. And he pointed out that it was necessary for people to be registered and to vote. And he did all that. He even talked about having people to monitor the vote, because he said the issue is about people monitoring their vote and have people in the polling stations. And we have over 25,000 polling stations in Cameroon. And it's difficult for for any political party that doesn't have the resources to be able to be there and do all these things. Yes, it sounds ideal to have people knock on doors and say, go and register, go and vote and walk around. But think about the impractical nature of some areas in Cameroon. I think you're talking about Western democracies.
No.
So,
I want to
okay.
just say that we cannot say it sounds ideal. I mean, what do you mean Western democracies? They have inaccessible places here. There's so many places in this country, in Canada, that are inaccessible. Do those people not vote? They mail in, there's provisions for mail-in ballots. There's all kinds of provisions. Look, we can't make excuses for disenfranchising people or for not giving people the opportunity to be able to cast their vote and perform that civic responsibility. And yes, I'm not being idealistic. If we really want change, people are going to have to do the work. You know, that's the problem. We kind of sit and buy into the democratic ideals that we see in the West, but we don't understand that it takes a lot of work and effort, and people don't want to do that. People are going to have to go and knock on doors and mobilize volunteers and do the same things that are being done to get people to go and vote. You know, that's the reality. So if we only sit and complain and say, oh, then we're going to have presidents who are going to remain there forever because they're going to say, look, I organized elections, people never turned up. The ones that turned up voted for me. So I guess that's democracy.
That's the conclusion of today's show. You heard it right. It means that when all is said and done, it seems only Cameroonians would have to devise ways and means to coexist and solve their problems. And so the Anglophone crisis can go away for Cameroon to go back to its shape that it was. However, it is not too late to apply diplomatic pressure so that the government in place can also stretch an olive branch and try to do more. Probably like my guest Mark said about reconciliation, reconstruction, and all those other big R's. And in this case, it requires the international community to also try to step in to mediate and be a role model, because again, we have to think at least 2 steps ahead before the lessons of past atrocities in other neighboring African countries becomes a reality in Cameroon. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for staying with us, and thank you for walking us through to the end. And this is where we call it a day for Worldview, and we'll be coming up to talk about another topic. It may be the Ambazonia nation, as it's been called, and it may be to talk about the role of the diaspora in all that is taking place in Cameroon, just like in other African countries. Stay tuned for more, and follow us, like, subscribe, share, and give us your thoughts. We are here to listen and make sure we can relate back to you. Remember, in any situation, if you're not part of the solution, don't be part of the problem. Thanks, and stay blessed.